Research team member, Taubenberg's team member, Johann Holton, finds and sends a remarkably well-preserved 1918 flu virus specimen from a frozen body killed by the 1918 flu to Dr. Taubenberger's lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. Now, again, he found this virus from a victim of the 1918 flu that was buried in a shallow grave in the permafrost and never really thought out. It was like putting it in an incubator, a frozen container. The virus's RNA-based gene fragments were analyzed by computer sequencing in order to reveal the complete genetic code. Even with the supercomputer, this code sequencing will take years to complete. In October of 2003, Taubenberger's team finally deciphers the deadly virus's entire genetic code and completes the 6-year project. Noted virologist and Taubenberger colleague R.G. Webster, in the same month, publishes an article in American Scientist magazine where the article declares, quote, "The world is teetering on the edge of a flu pandemic that could kill a large fraction of the human population," end quote. November of 2003, just a month later, George W. Bush issues Executive Order number 13295 on bioterrorism. Remember what happened right after September 11th? Right after that, we had smallpox vaccines that were given to the troops that were contaminated. Remember that? Do you also remember what happened? There was some anthrax spores, weapons-grade anthrax that originated from Fort Detrick, somehow got mailed to certain members of Congress and certain members of the media, created quite a panic and terror at that time. Americans were uncertain what to think. Oh golly, we just got attacked by terrorism. We're now engaged in a war on terror. We're out invading now Afghanistan. And in 2003, we just invaded Iraq because of the war on terror, right? So George W. Bush issues an executive order, number 13295, entitled Bioterrorism. In this executive order, President Bush makes individual American citizens subject to, quote, unrestricted apprehension and detention, end quote. When? In the event of an outbreak of disease in the public sector. For the first time, Americans can be rounded up and apprehended and incarcerated, just like what's going on right now in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, just because there's an outbreak of disease in American soil. A year and a half later, 18 months later, in April 2005, something really interesting happens. George W. Bush amends the language of his 2003 Executive Order 13295, specifically detailing the event that would make individuals, quote, subject to unrestricted apprehension and detention, and that event is specifically amended to state, quote, influenza caused by novel or re-emergent influenza viruses that are causing or have the potential to cause a pandemic. Let me again re-emphasize. Here's his executive order, making individual American citizens subject to arrest without trial, detention for as long as is deemed necessary. For what? For influenza caused by a novel, which means new, or re-emergent influenza virus. Okay, here we find the timeline. Bush amends his executive order in April. Well, guess what happens in August? August 2005, the team in Fort Detrick inserts plasmids into human kidney cells, which then transfers human DNA into the 1918 virus, making it human-specific now. The deadly 1918 virus that killed millions and millions of people, and which nature reversed by itself from its deadly nature, is now militarized and ready for use by conspiring men in August of 2005. A month later, September 9th, 2005, the United Nations in New York City. Now let me again, the UN is largely Rockefeller envisioned, and Rockefeller himself, John D., and his family donated the land in New York, and built the actual United Nations Center now. It's a Rockefeller-controlled institution. The UN in New York City issues a shocking worldwide press release on September 9th of 2005. Here in this press release, they introduce a man named David Nabarro as, quote, the UN System Senior Coordinator for Avian, Human Influenza. 20 days later, on September 29th of 2005, fear and panic officially began worldwide when Nabarro, on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly, issues what's called, a quote, an official UN warning that, quote, an outbreak of avian influenza would kill between 5 million and 150 million people on each continent. Not may, not could, not has the potential to. No, he says would kill. Well, the next month, ex-Utah Governor Mike Leavitt jumps into the battle. President Bush's newly appointed Secretary of Health and Human Services, Michael Okerlund Leavitt of Utah, officially begins the pandemic bird flu preparations in earnest. In December of 2005, Bush solicits Congress for $7.1 billion to fund his preparations. Only $3.3 billion is immediately allocated to Leavitt, however. The Health and Human Services, the HHS, what I call the candy store, is now officially open for business, and let the propaganda games begin. January 2006, Leavitt officially launches his website called pandemicflu.gov. Here he declares, quote, let me be clear. It is only a matter of time before we discover H5N1 in America. The migration patterns of the wild fowl that carry the virus makes its appearance here almost inevitable. Governor Leavitt, Secretary Leavitt, for heaven's sakes, H5N1 is already here. You take any virologist and study the blood and structure of the bird population, H5N1 in its non-toxic, non-lethal state is already here. It's already here in Utah. It's already here in America. It's just not going to affect humans. It hasn't before, and without help from you, it never will. January 2006, Mike Leavitt goes over to Beijing, to China, because a Chinese host was called, quote, the International Pledging Conference on Avian and Human Influenza in Beijing. The purpose? China is extracting massive sums of money from the West. Leavitt commits $334 million to Communist China in funds to aid China's research into what? Quote, vaccine development.